Well, good morning. Thank you all for joining us here in the room and online. This is a really important day for the BPC. Today we are delighted to be launching the J. Ron Terwilliger Center on Housing Policy. We're going to be sharing a lot more about our inspiration, Ron, talk about the center and some of our plans, but just to situate this discussion, I wanted to say a few words about the Bipartisan Policy Center's history in the housing policy debate. Almost to this day, a decade ago, policymakers were grappling with a tremendous foreclosure crisis in this country, brought on by a fundamentally broken housing finance system. Recognizing the need for a new vision for housing policy, the Bipartisan Policy Center forged a new housing commission. The 21-member group was chaired by former HUD Secretaries Henry Cisneros and Mel Martinez, former U.S. Senators George Mitchell and Kit Bond. The staff was led by our very own Pam Patnaud. Two of our most compelling commission members, Ron Terwilliger and Renee Glover, were part of that system. We came to this authentically with a great amount of interest and enthusiasm, developed a pretty sweeping, comprehensive report which came up with housing finance recommendations, a significant set of proposals to address affordable rental housing and deal with the efficiency of the housing aid and basically kind of a really revamp of a lot of the key housing policies. It had a real impact. We moved on from there in 2015 to think about the intersection of health and housing. We had a task force in one case that came out with a set of recommendations that were critical to the senior health and housing decisions, the Older Americans Act, where we helped to kind of reauthorize and create some coordination between aging in place and also some focus on Medicaid coverage for home modifications. More recently, as the nation has begun to grapple with the long overdue focus on racial equity and opportunity, we brought together another commission. It is a housing council that is brought together to have some really tough and candid conversations about racism, discrimination, and housing, and develop a viable and durable set of policy solutions. So now it's 10 years from our entry into the housing policy debate, and the nation, of course, is in another terrible crisis. The pandemic, resulting economic dislocation, has amplified housing instability, evictions, and homelessness. The center we are launching today reflects the deep commitment of both the Bipartisan Policy Center and Ron Terwilliger to the notion that every American family deserves a decent, safe, and affordable place to live. I'm deeply grateful, Ron, to the unprecedented investment that you're making in this institution, and also to your commitment for pragmatic, durable, and evidence-based public policy. And while today is something of a celebration, it's also a great responsibility for us. As we speak, 15 million Americans are behind in their rent and vulnerable to eviction. As I was awakened by the rain last night here in Washington, D.C., I thought a moment about the folks who were also having that experience with an eviction notice on their bedside table. This is an urgent humanity and public health crisis. And so we come to this opportunity not to write reports, make ourselves feel good, but the measure of our success is outcomes. And we invite everyone in this room and everyone online to join us in what we think of as the fierce urgency of pragmatism and bring the country together to actually address the fundamental right of people to have quality housing. So as I turn it over to the day, I want to first of all very much thank Secretary Fudge for helping us mark this special occasion. And now a real pleasure to introduce former HUD Secretary Henry Cisneros. He is a Bipartisan Policy Center board member. He is an innovative business leader. He has been really one of the key ingredients to the BPC's success across the board over the last decade. And I am proud to say he is also a dear friend. Henry, thank you.
Jason, thank you very much. Thank you for your kind words, but more importantly, thank you for creating, envisioning, and then leading the BPC over all of these years. Today is a big day for the BPC because the announcement that is being made today with respect to the Terwilliger Housing Center represents the first time that the BPC actually funds a center of this nature on a focused subject. And I'm very pleased that it is housing that brings us to that point. There are several dimensions to today's launch that are important. One of them, as Jason has already said, is the Bipartisan Policy Center and its approach of trying to find bipartisan answers to American challenges, and particularly its approach in housing. For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC, and they have gotten into the legislative discussion and administration discussions over that span of time. This is an important day in the sense that this new platform will give the BPC a greater voice in the national housing dialogue. Another dimension, of course, is Ron Terwilliger, a dear friend. Ron is, in my judgment, from having been across the country, it's hopefully an informed judgment, the person that I identify as having done more in the housing arena as a private citizen than any person I can think of. Ron was first at Trammell Crow Residential, formed the company, and built over 200,000 units, Madam Secretary, of housing, of private housing in the country. From there, on retirement, rather than take the easy course and serve on some corporate boards or something, he stayed in the housing field, and in the intervening years was the head of Habitat for Humanity internationally, where he also gave the largest gift that's ever been given philanthropically in America to something other than a hospital or a university, when he gave $100 million to Habitat for Humanity to expand their efforts around the world. He also was the head of Enterprise Foundation, continues to work there in expanding the search for affordable housing. So my point is that this is a person who knew housing from a private sector and investment standpoint, and then brought all of that knowledge and applied it to the housing field. He has been meticulous in his focus on this arena, and today's launch is another example of that, because this will give the BPC and the country a place in which bipartisan solutions, new ideas about housing can be advanced. Still another dimension of today's launch is the fact that we're honored to have Secretary Fudge join us. She's the 18th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and she leads the department in a particularly challenging time, with a pandemic that has left millions of Americans struggling to afford housing and issues related to eviction and so forth, a national shortage of affordable homes which continues to push up housing prices, and then, of course, an unconscionable number of homeless people on the streets on any given night, the size of a fairly substantial American city, the number of people, 600,000 or so on the streets on any given night. We can do better than that, and we have the right person in the right job at the right time in Secretary Fudge. Prior to joining the Biden administration, Secretary Fudge served in the Congress as a representative for the 11th Congressional District of Ohio near Cleveland. But that was after she had been the mayor of Warrensville Heights. And so she brings a local government perspective, which I think is very important to the cabinet position that deals with America's cities and urban areas and housing. She chaired the Congressional Black Caucus and has assiduously worked over the years to support measures that touch the lives of vulnerable and marginalized Americans. HUD, since its original creation in 1965 in President Johnson's administration, was organized for the purpose, yes, of producing housing generally and upholding the housing sector, large part of the national economy generally, but especially to deal with those Americans who are the most unhoused and the most in need of housing. And we stand on the precipice of a time when the initiatives being discussed right this moment in the Congress and in the administration will bring very substantial resources to housing that will allow Secretary Fudge to lead us towards some truly innovative approaches to deal with the problem of homelessness and people who are underhoused. We look forward to working with you, Secretary, in that endeavor. I know there's a search for what are the best ideas, what are the best initiatives, how do we disseminate that information across the country. You'll be the point of that, but we look forward in this center to being helpful. So we want to sincerely thank you for honoring us today, enhancing this launch by your presence, and we look forward to working closely with you and your team at HUD in the months ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, the Secretary of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, Secretary Marcia Fudge.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I like that call and response thing. Good morning. It's so good to be here with you all. I want to thank Secretary Cisneros for the introduction. I have met so many people at HUD that talk about you all the time. And so I've started to become a little jealous. But I really do find it a pleasure to try to build on the legacy you left, because people are still talking about the great work you did. So I appreciate that. My thanks as well to Deputy Secretary Pam Patinoff for being here with us today. Probably one of the few people that worked in 2 different administrations at HUD, so we're thankful. To my new best friend, Ron Terwilliger, I just want you to thank you for your generous support to start the center. And for my sister at the end, Renee Glover, thank you so much for being here as well. Congratulations to the Bipartisan Policy Center on today's launch. I want to thank President Krume, am I right? Mm-hmm. For all your great work, and for more than a decade that your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems, whether it be healthcare, energy, education, immigration, and we're dealing with all of those as we speak. In an era that has been marked by division and polarization, I'm so very pleased that you all prioritize people and not politics, and I thank you for that. Housing is bipartisan. Not only is it infrastructure, it is bipartisan. We all can find common ground when we talk about housing, no matter which side of the aisle we stand on. We all know that our homes lay the foundation upon which all of us build our lives. I agree with the words of President Ronald Reagan when he said that home ownership is an essential part of the American dream. We want to build a society where more and more families from all walks of life can afford to buy their own homes. And so I'm pleased to join BPC today to reinforce our shared commitment to expand housing opportunities. In many ways, our work is more important now than it ever has been. It is harder to find an affordable home in America today than at any point since 2008 during the financial crisis. Millions of Americans, the high cost of housing is creating a cloud over their head. It's like an albatross around their neck. It is time for us to look at how we address these things in this season. Now, I am a person of very strong faith, and it is my faith that drives my work every day. And it drives me to help improve the lives of people who are in need. The Bible actually talks about the poor more than 200 times. You know, we have a lot of people that quote the Bible, but they don't quote the content any way that it was meant to be quoted. So I just want you to know that poverty is something that is front and center with me, because poor people in this country have become invisible. You pass by these encampments day after day after day, maybe after the second or third week, you don't even see them anymore. And so Jesus told his disciples that what we do for the least of these, we do unto him. We are charged to help those who live on the outskirts of hope, to help the disadvantaged and the dispossessed, the weary and the working poor. Ecclesiastes says, to everything there's a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, a time to break down and a time to build up. It is time for us to build up a new America that is stronger, fairer, and more equitable than the one that we just came out of pre-pandemic, to help form a more perfect union. I have faith that America will emerge from this time of crisis stronger than ever before. I have faith that it is time for America to build up, to build back better, because we, as Americans, have done this so many times before. Time after time in our history, we faced defining moments. Our finest moments, though, were when our leaders understood that times of great challenge require bold action. The Civil War spurred Lincoln to free the slaves. The Great Depression brought about Social Security, unemployment insurance, and historic victories for working people. The GI Bill followed World War II and helped millions of soldiers attend college and buy homes, laying the foundation for what has become the American middle class. The struggle for civil rights led America to enact a series of landmark laws called the Great Society laws. Among them were voting rights, Fair Housing Act, and the law that actually established HUD, in addition to Medicare and Medicaid. These moments in history prove the wisdom of the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville. He came to this country to try to determine what made us such a great nation. And he concluded that greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather her ability to repair her faults. It is time for us to repair our faults. We can begin to repair America's affordable housing crisis through the President's Build Back Better agenda. The agenda will make historic investments in America's housing, investments that will transform the lives of people. The agenda will build or preserve millions of affordable homes in big cities, small towns, rural communities, and tribal lands. And it will reverse years of neglect in our communities, especially for people of color, the poor, and those of modest means. It is an agenda that is centered around equity. It will ensure that folks who really are of greatest need, those who need support the most, will receive it, and they will receive it first, and they will get their fair share. It will assist more Americans with the down payment on their first homes and build a source of wealth they can pass down from generation to generation. It will strengthen incentives for developers, Ron, to build more affordable homes, incentives like raising the cap on low-income housing tax credits. It will contain major investments in HUD programs that produce and preserve affordable housing, the Housing Trust Fund, the Home Investment Partnership Program, and project-based rental assistance. Many of these programs have not seen a significant increase in decades. The President's agenda is going to address all of those issues. It will revitalize America's public housing. Nearly half of all of the public housing in this country is more than 50 years old. And they have been neglected, and they are properties that face major capital needs. The President's agenda will help ensure every person in America in public housing lives in a safe and secure neighborhood and a safe and secure home. The agenda will protect the American people from climate change. We've just seen these storms come across this country. We're going to talk about sustainable infrastructure, more energy efficient properties. It is time that we create the kind of jobs in this country we can. And we do it by building roads and bridges, the things that are in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which we are hopeful is going to pass sometime soon. And I am very, very proud to work in the administration of a president who understands the historic challenges, and they require historic responsibilities and responses. 50 years ago, President John F. Kennedy declared to Congress that we should, as Americans, go to the moon. JFK knew it would be the greatest challenge in our nation's history. So he assembled the best minds in the world to try to conquer it. One of them was Wernher von Braun, a NASA space engineer. Someone asked von Braun what America needed in order to build a rocket that would reach the moon. He replied with just 5 simple words: the will to do it. The will to do it. Today, Joe Biden is ready to launch our nation on another great journey, not to lift a man to the moon or to the stars, but to lift millions of Americans, to take care of home in the most literal sense. So Joe Biden has got the will. HUD has the will to do it. Every member of this administration has the will to do it, but we cannot do it alone. We need the help of every person watching and listening today. Congress is on the brink of passing historic housing investments. We need your help to get that agenda across the finish line. America can do anything as long as we have the will to do it. We can end our affordable housing crisis as long as we have the will to do it. In this season of change, let us embark on our next great journey as one nation with a shared will and common purpose. Let us build back better, because I know we have the will to do it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Secretary Fudge, for the very thoughtful comments, and we wish you continued success at HUD. Thanks again.
I'm only rushing because my staff always schedules me too tight, so I must go.
Thank you. Good morning to our audience here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's wonderful to be in person. It's wonderful to get the band back together, as Jason Grumet said. Henry and Renee and Ron and I had the privilege of working here at the Bipartisan Policy Center about 10 years ago, and it's just wonderful to be working with both of you again. So Henry introduced Ron, but I want to just add to that introduction. Ron is a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy, where he just recently endowed a center, a student athlete center, so he continues to be very active, and he also recently joined the Naval Academy Foundation Board. Ron is the longtime chairman of Enterprise Community Partners. We have the CEO here with us this morning, Priscilla Almador. Ron is also the chair of I Have a Dream Foundation, which is focused on educating disadvantaged youth. And for the last almost 15 years, I've had the privilege to work with Ron. This is now our 5th initiative. Our journey began back in 2007 when I joined Ron at the ULI Terwilliger Center for Workforce Housing, where we worked with the private sector to develop policy solutions. From there, we joined the Bipartisan Policy Center together. We were a package deal, as Jason likes to say. And we worked for 3 years on federal policy, setting a new direction for federal policy in America. Our 4th joint venture was the Terwilliger Foundation for Housing America's Families, where we spent many days on Capitol Hill educating members of Congress. And we also worked to educate presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle. And so today I'm so pleased, Ron, to be here to launch the first named center at the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. And Renee, it's so wonderful to be working with you again. Renee is the founder of the Catalyst Group. Renee was executive director of one of the largest housing authorities in America, the Atlanta Housing Authority. And she is truly a thought leader in the affordable housing field. So Renee, thank you again for joining us. So Ron, I'm going to start with you. People really want to know, why did you get involved in housing? How did this all start? And I think, I know that it started with a real estate course at Harvard Business School, but if you could just share with the audience, what ignited your passion both to get involved in real estate in the private sector and then as a philanthropist in affordable housing?
Well, thank you, Pam. But before I respond, let me first tell you it's so great to be here with you. Pam and I, as she said, we worked together in different capacities for 15 years. And Renee and I started as co-chair of Mayor Franklin's. We had a workforce housing policy center in Atlanta. And then Renee and I have served on the Habitat board together, and now she's on the Enterprise board. So she's one of the great luminaries in housing, and I'm so pleased to have you here. And finally, she's gone now, but I really am appreciative of Secretary Fudge being here to kick this off. And Jason, thank you for you and Henry and Pam sponsoring this idea. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. Maybe it'll be helpful. I grew up in Arlington, Virginia, not far from here. My dad moved down from Walden, New York in the late 30s just to get a job during the Depression. Met my mom, and I was born in 41 in Arlington, raised there. Arlington, Virginia at that time was incredibly different than it is today. You could actually move around easily. I remember riding my bike to elementary school, which I don't think anybody let their kids do these days. But I had 2 parents, a modest house. Think about what housing is today. And in this pandemic, so many people don't have a place to quarantine, don't have a place to work from home. I had 800 square feet, 3-bedroom, 1 bath. We didn't know that was relatively low or moderate income. It was what we were used to. And I had really good public schools and a great neighborhood of camaraderie with neighbors growing up. So I thought it was kind of the way everybody lived. my dad worked 2 jobs so my mom could stay home and raise us. They never showed me at a university, and I finally figured out because they couldn't afford to send me to college. But I was a good athlete, and I got recruited by the Naval Academy to come to Navy, where I played basketball and baseball. And as I think Pam or Henry mentioned, I'm actually chairman of the Naval Academy Foundation, chairman-elect. I find the Naval Academy really inspirational, and am trying to give back there. My philanthropy is principally housing, a little bit of education, but the Naval Academy is an exception because I think it's an exceptional place training young leaders for this country. So I went there and graduated, served 5 years in the Navy. At that time we had a 4-year obligation, but I'm a product of Vietnam, and I ended up getting extended a year. I actually applied for the Navy to send me to Harvard Business School, and they made me a first alternate, so I resigned and went on my own. So I entered Harvard at the age of 27, and like a lot of people, because my father really wasn't in business, he was selling wholesale petroleum products, and at night he was either relief movie manager or relief jailer. I had no idea what business was like. I have a fairly good gift in math and quantitative aspects, and I took one course at Harvard, one real estate course that really changed my life, and I decided to go into real estate. So after spending some time at Hilton Head, if you all know that resort community, we actually went bankrupt and I had to move on. I went to the construction industry, and then I had the good fortune to join Trammell Crow. Some of you know that name. At the time, when I joined in '78, they were the largest developer of commercial and residential. And I ended up becoming CEO and worked there almost 30 years. Think I've built more apartments probably than anybody. It's been a great business. And then I retired, but during that time, I was in a lot of industry organizations, and I began to gain some wealth from the scale of apartments. We would build about 10,000 units a year, and I found myself at 55, as I tell the story, kind of thinking about, what am I going to do with this wealth? You know, I'll leave some to my kids, but I don't want to mess up my kids by making it possible for them not to work and be as good as they can be. And so I thought, you know, my wealth comes from housing. I have credibility in housing. I think that's where I should principally give back. So I joined Habitat's board in 2000. I was a board chair from 2007 to 9 when I agreed to chair their global capital campaign. So I still am on the board of Habitat 21 years later. Kind of an ex officio board member. I'm the global fundraising leader for Habitat, and we have a center at Habitat that does innovation in shelter around the world. Because housing problems are obviously, you know that, not limited to the U.S. In fact, in some third world countries, they're way worse than they are here. Interestingly, around the globe, about 70% of houses are built by the families who own them, and they build them incrementally because the mortgage systems don't exist. So I stayed involved in that sphere for quite some time, and then I began to get involved with other groups. I chaired the board of the Urban Land Institute, and when I left, created a housing center. It was, interestingly, Jason, the first center at ULI, and Pam was my first executive director, and that center continues. We focused on workforce housing initially. Workforce housing we defined as people making between 60 and 120% of area median income, because the low-income housing tax credit and other subsidy programs typically help people from 60% or less. And there's a lot of working families. Washington, D.C. area is a great example, who can't live anywhere near where they work because they don't qualify for low-income housing tax credit programs. It continues to be a big problem. And then, you know, I got involved with Enterprise 11 years ago. Priscilla Almodovar, my CEO, is here tonight, and we are working really hard on housing, particularly important and critical time today in the industry. So, you know, what I think is that housing is foundational for family growth, and if you go back to basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter, we're talking about shelter. I think housing is a basic human right. I think governments all over the world should feel responsible for housing their families. I don't think many do. And I think for the United States, I'm hoping, and I think Secretary Fudge and President Biden have given more emphasis recently on housing. So I'm hoping that there will be a lot more emphasis from the public sector, because it's a challenge. Housing is a challenge for so many American families. I consider it an income problem. So many American families do not make enough income to afford the rent in their marketplace, much less to buy a house. So I kind of bring it all back, Pam, to my upraising. I've lived the American dream. I came from a family, my parents never went to college. I don't even know if they finished high school. But I was able to go to the Naval Academy and get into business in this capitalistic society and do very well financially. And it just seems to me that what we need is to give every family that opportunity for the opportunity to go to get a decent education and to advance to whatever their family's potential is. And housing is foundational for that.
Thank you, Ron. I'm going to turn it over to Renee to continue this conversation.
Absolutely. And before I ask the question, I just want to say it is an honor and privilege to be here, Ron. You know, we go back some 30 years now.
Right.
Nobody's really counting. And Ron has just been outstanding. And it's so rare to have that mixture of knowledge, business, but the passion and heart to care for the people. And so you've been a hero for a very, very long time, and it's been an honor to work with you and know you at Habitat, Enterprise, the other ventures, the Bipartisan Center. And I also want to say, Pam, you are just outstanding. I've gotten to know you over the years, and you did a great job in leading us through the 2011 effort. And Henry, I absolutely just adore and love. I mean, I've known him when I first joined the Housing Authority. He was secretary and just did a magnificent job. I always think about him as an entrepreneurial secretary. And Jason, you're just doing a great job leading the effort. And Priscilla is fabulous. So all of that said, Ron, you have spent so many years and so much of your personal treasure to address what you call the silent crisis in housing. What do you mean by that when you refer to it?
Thank you, Renee. You know, I told you my background. I worked nationally in housing. I had 23 offices at Trammell Crow Residential, so we built all over the country. But I must say, until I was asked to give the Dunlop Lecture on Housing Policy at Harvard, which is, I think, a lecture that Henry's given, I think Mel Martinez has given, I think I was the first private sector person to be asked. I was nervous about what I would say, and I did a lot of research on the housing circumstances in this country. And I was shocked to find out how bad it was. And I made that lecture, and I determined to try to figure out how I could do more to address it. Pam and I worked at the ULI Terwilliger Center for Housing, starting on workforce housing. And then after we finished the BPC commission study and wrote the final report, she and I worked for about 3 years at a foundation I created to advocate for more support from the public sector, from the federal government. I always say, you know, there's an old saying, why did Jesse James rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Well, you know, the federal government was providing an awful lot of subsidy for housing, but most of it came through the mortgage interest deduction, which I thought was completely mistargeted. You know, if you all probably know you have to itemize to even benefit from it, mostly well-to-do individuals. And if that money had been redirected to support low-income families, either being able to afford rental housing or home ownership. So Pam and I spent a lot of time on the Hill, and I've never figured out how many people we talked to. It must have been 60 or 70 congressmen and senators. And I found that very few people in Congress, almost none, realized we had this housing crisis going on. You know, congressmen get paid not a lot of money by some people's standards, but enough money to afford their rent or to own a home, and they seem to be pretty much totally unaware, with just a few exceptions. So what Pam and I figured out we had to do was, first we had to educate, and we worked with Dennis. Dennis did a great deal of research and writing for us. So we worked with Dennis to be able to articulate what was going on in this country, how bad it was, how many families were unable to afford rent, much less become homeowners. So our approach was educate Congress, then it almost goes without saying, but convince them that it mattered, that housing matters, that housing is foundational for family growth, and then come up with some solutions. So we advocated for dramatically expanding the low-income housing tax credit. That's something that came in '86 law. It's now permanent, and it's a great program because it's a public-private sector partnership. The private sector, I was telling Secretary Fudge, the private sector in this country is really strong in housing. We're now building about 1.3 million housing units a year. Or arguably, we need to build a good bit more. But unless the private sector can get a subsidy, we can't afford it. I was explaining to her that I'm involved in a company in the Southeast, and for a 900 square foot apartment, it costs us about $180,000 to build it. And at least half the country cannot afford the rents we have to charge to be able to build that project. So it's a challenge, but we know that we've got to focus on supply side solutions and demand side solutions. At least that's my view. So we advocated that Congress redirect its subsidy because in order to build more projects, you have to subsidize what it costs. Sadly today, after this pandemic and the backside of the pandemic, the whole cost solution's been exacerbated. My company is trying to build an apartment project in Atlanta, and we've had a 35% cost increase just in the last 6 months. At the same time in this country, rents are going up faster than they've ever gone up. On the private sector, in the market rate, rents have gone up 15% in the last year in many southeastern markets, further exacerbating the affordability issue. So I think what we need to think about is how do we add to supply and how can we supplement demand, because we're somewhere between, one statistic is 5.5 million, another 7 million, short on what we need to build in housing. We need to add a whole lot of product, and it's only going to come with further support, I think, from the governments. And you all probably know there's the cost of it, and then there's the zoning. And zoning, as we all well know, can be a terrible difficulty, particularly when you're trying to build density. We have in this country decided that the zoning would be local. What happens in so many areas is that people who have their homes, the old what they call NIMBY syndrome, not in my backyard, you get exclusionary zonings, you can't build density, you can't build accessory dwelling units. So there's a role for the local governments and the state governments, and there's a role for the federal governments, and we're hoping that we can touch base with all of them. Right now, the composition of the demographics in this country is changing. According to the Urban Institute, between 2020 and 2040, all of the net household growth in this country is minority. So to the extent we have a challenge today with minority households being able to afford the rent for a project, much less home ownership, that's going to get even tougher. And we've got an enormous problem that's getting worse. I'm certainly encouraged that the Biden administration seems to be taking it on and seems to clearly be aware of it.
Thank you, Ron, for outlining those tremendous challenges ahead of us. Could you share with the audience what programs you think are working, what policy solutions are making a real difference?
Yeah, it's, the size of the problem is really big, right? You've got 50% of renters who are, paying more than 30% of their income for housing. You've got 25% of renters who's paying more than 50% of their income for rental. You've got so many people who cannot afford home ownership. What I think is working at the scale it's working is the low-income housing tax credit. I commented it earlier. Basically, we award, based on population, to housing authorities credits, 9% credits, 4% credits. My company had a program years ago where we took advantage of it. You get the subsidy through selling the tax credit. Enterprise is one of the biggest syndicators in the country, so I'm familiar with what's going on now. And the last estimates I heard is building new projects with the tax credits, which frequently you have to get supplemental subsidies for. We can build about 50,000 new units a year. We probably renovate and keep in the system another 50,000. But according to Doug Bibby at the National Multi-Housing Council, which is representing the multifamily industry, we lose 100,000 a year. So we need, in my opinion, a whole lot more low-income housing tax credits. And that's a public-private venture where the private sector's ability to build can be unleashed if there's an adequate subsidy. On the demand side, we have the voucher program. And I'm a big fan of that. And the way the vouchers work, as I understand it, is that people who qualify for Section 8 vouchers basically pay 30% of their income for rental housing, and then the government makes up the difference between the market rent and their 30%. That's a way of supplementing on the demand side. But only 1 in 5 people eligible these days get it because it's an annual appropriation. The tax credit comes through the tax system in this country. This is an annual appropriation. So, you know, I'm a fan of the idea of having universal vouchers, which would cost the federal government a whole lot more money to take care of the people who need it and who qualify. Right now, it's kind of like a lottery system. You're just so fortunate if you get it. So that's supplementing it on the demand side. The other thing that can be done, if there's will, I co-chair Habitat's U.S. advocacy campaign, and we are trying to get our affiliates throughout the country to talk about the problem with state and local governments, because that's, as I mentioned earlier, where zoning resides. And a lot of people in, you know, more affluent neighborhoods preclude multifamily, preclude lower income people from moving in. They're afraid it's going to diminish their values. There's lots of studies that show the impact is not what people think, but nevertheless, zoning is a big problem, exclusionary zoning. And California now, incidentally, is starting to, at the state level, take some action in this area. So that's another way we can expand it. We can also allow accessory dwelling units so that existing housing can have renters, whether it's in their garage or in their basement. That's a relatively inexpensive way to help, but we got to really work on all of these things because it's going to require an enormous subsidy, and it's going to require people being committed. And as I said at the outset, I think housing is a human right, and I wish other people who can do something about it would feel that way, but I'm not sure that they do. It's not getting nearly the amount of emphasis it should get. Health, education, talk about those a lot, but housing, I asked Secretary Fudge if we should make sure in President Biden's State of the Union that he talked about housing the next time, because that's rarely happens. I mean, the last big emphasis at the federal level, and maybe that's not the way to characterize it, but I always like to talk about the 1949 Housing Act, which set an aspirational goal for our country, that every American family have a decent home and a suitable living environment. I think Secretary Cisneros mentioned that. If we would just pay attention to that aspirational goal, you know, some 70 years ago, it's in our self-interest as a country to take care of the housing for our families, and we're not doing a very good job of it.
Thank you, Ron. Renee, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yeah, so timing is everything. And here we are, I think, on the precipice of doing something fabulous for America's families. And the Build Back Better plan is articulated by Biden and Secretary Fudge, and their passionate leadership is out in the universe. And so the timing and the naming of the J. Ronald Terwilliger Housing Policy Center and being housed in the Bipartisan Policy Center is no accident. So I'd love to hear from you what you think the center's value proposition is and what's going to be unique about the fabulous work that I know is going to happen.
Well, as I think has already been said, it would seem almost obvious that housing should be a bipartisan issue. It's amazing to me that vaccinations has become a partisan issue in this country. But housing is a bipartisan issue, and I think we have a chance here at the BPC to really influence federal policy going forward. I'm certainly hoping so. We're putting together an advisory board. Henry and Pam have agreed to serve on it. Renee's agreed to serve on it. Sean Donovan, former HUD secretary. So we have an advisory board that's shaping up, and we also have a couple of people, Chris Van Hollen and Todd Young, who are members of Congress. We're trying to put together a congressional group to advise us because we want to influence federal housing policy. In the end, I think at all levels of government, but particularly I think at the federal level where there is so much potential, they've got to do more. So we're hoping with the credibility of the Bipartisan Policy Center, with a strong advisory board, with the staff we have here at BPC, an arm that lobbies the government, and we'll carry our message to the Congress as to how important it is and to how bad it is. Another dimension that I haven't mentioned about the issue is the location of the housing. We have, as we talk about in Enterprise and others, we have a concern that the opportunity agenda for families includes where the house is located and what access to health care and education comes from it. But again, because of NIMBYism, it's really hard to get these houses located where they need to be so that the kids can get a good education, because the way in this country to break multi-generational poverty is to have those kids get educated, be self-sustaining, and pull that family up. But the location of the housing is critical. We talked about vouchers earlier. There's something I think should be a federal law as a source of income discrimination. Right now, people in good neighborhoods don't have to take the voucher. Landlords don't have to take the voucher. Maybe we need some reform at HUD as to making it more palatable for these private landlords. But that is another problem. Because, as Raj Chetty's research discussed, unfortunately in this country, the zip code you're born in tends to have a predictor of where your life outcome is. Because if you're born into a lower income neighborhood with failing schools and you can't get out of that and your kids can't get a decent education, the chances that their life outcome is going to be different is just dramatically reduced. So there's something called a mobility voucher, which helps get families to move into better neighborhoods. But again, the landlords have to take the voucher, and the location of the housing has got to be in an opportunity neighborhood, and that's too rarely happens. So that's kind of the way I think about it, Renee. BPC, I'm kind of a part of the No Labels group, and I believe in bipartisanship, and I don't know that anybody should think of housing as a partisan issue. It seems to me it's a bipartisan issue. We just need to get people informed as to what the magnitude of the problem is, convinced that it's a problem that needs to be solved, and willing to put the money and the programs together to make a meaningful difference. It's a big problem, and we have to come up with some big ideas here at BPC. Nibbling away at it is not going to do it. And I think the Biden administration will give us a good start, but there's a lot more work that's going to need to be done to have this country be a country we can all be proud of and saying all of our citizens are well housed. Why wouldn't you want to be able to say that about your country?
Ron, we just have a few minutes, so I'm going to just turn to see if there are some questions from the audience. I believe Andy has some questions here for us. So the first question from our viewer audience is asking Ron, what does the center hope to achieve in the short term, and what does the Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy hope to achieve in the long run?
Well, I think in the short run, Secretary Fudge talked a little bit about it, as did Henry, I think. Right now we have an opportunity with this reconciliation bill to maybe get, I think it's $300 billion if it stays. A big slug into housing. It's been a long time since that's come along. So I think in the short term, Jason, we should work in trying to make sure that we are advocates for intelligence spending and working with HUD and trying to make sure that the programs that are implemented are effective and efficient. That's in the short term. The longer term, this problem, as I discussed my private sector experience, is getting worse, way worse right now. So I think our hope is that we can come up with some significant new programs, public-private sector partnerships, where we can be effective in mobilizing the private sector. There's still work to do in the public housing agencies. I thought, and Renee would know this better than me, but I thought the RAD program was effective in getting the private sector engaged and trying to make sure that the public housing doesn't go into disarray. There's still a lot of people in this country in public housing. Zoning, if we can take it on, Habitat's trying to do that. If we can get state governors to really help make sure there are zoning policies. But once again, people have to be committed. They have to believe that it's a problem and it's important and something needs to change. I see a little bit of that going on in California now, and I hope that'll continue. So we don't want to be a country where the zip code you're born in determines your future. We have to be better than that. And I see this challenge worldwide, but I'm a big advocate for having the U.S. take leadership, and there's got to just be a lot more focus by the people. I mean, one of the issues I think that we talked about is it's not in the media much. It's, media doesn't talk about it either. Talk about health, talk about education, but not much about the housing challenge. So,
Ron, that's our next question from our viewer audience. Why do you think that housing gets so little attention, and how can we encourage more philanthropists to invest in affordable housing?
It's a tough question because it's baffled me. It's why I've called it the silent housing crisis, because there doesn't seem to me much coverage. I think, and I'm hoping that President Biden, as I said in his State of the Union, will raise it, not even wait till the State of the Union, start talking about it. He is committed to it. Secretary Fudge talked about sitting down with him and him having a focus on housing and making sure that of the money that Congress is trying to appropriate, a significant amount of it goes to housing. I don't really know. It's just perplexing to me. I'm hoping that there are enough people in this country that will focus on it, whether we can encourage some from the BPC. A lot of people will look at what's going on, and maybe we have to have an outreach program here at BPC to try and touch people who can make housing a priority, because some of the foundations do, and they come in and out. Unfortunately, I don't think there are a lot of private philanthropists like me who see it as their role. Part of the issue, I think, is it's so expensive, and home ownership is something you all know is an aspiration for many American families. About 67% of our families own homes, but the disparity between black and white home ownership is dramatic. I think the last statistic I saw was something like 43% of African American families owned home and 73% of white families. homeowners have 40 times the net worth of renters, and yet trying to, and that's one of the things I think you've been working at, Jason, is racial equity, trying to find ways to have the minority communities become homeowners is challenging today. But one of the things that affordable rental housing will do is it'll make them not have to spend more than 30% of their income and give them a chance to save for a down payment. And then there's a lot of things we can try to do from a rental assistance, from a down payment assistance standpoint. But I don't know, Pam, it's amazing to me because obviously it caught my eye, 25 years ago, and I'm a housing guy. It's been my whole life spent in housing. It just seems so obvious that it's so important, and yet it doesn't get the coverage. And maybe today's podcast and announcements will start that. Habitat certainly works on it. Habitat's got a great reputation, known for home ownership, as you all know, although our U.S. advocacy campaign that I co-chair with Jonathan Reckford on housing affordability is agnostic between home ownership and rental. We just want people to be in a decent home that they can afford in a safe neighborhood where their kids can get to school and they can get to health care and they can get to work. And this country's got to do a better job of that.
Well, Ron, thank you for this extraordinary commitment to the Bipartisan Policy Center. I look forward to working with you and Renee, with Henry Cisneros, and with Dennis Shea and Secretary Donovan to develop policy solutions. So today's the beginning. Hopefully we will make some real significant progress, and your major contributions as a philanthropist hopefully will ignite the desire to fund by other philanthropists. So at this time I'd like to welcome Dennis Shea. Dennis is a fellow houser. Dennis worked alongside us here at the BPC. He also served as the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And most recently, we welcomed Dennis home from Switzerland, where he served as an ambassador and deputy U.S. trade representative. So Dennis, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Pam, and good morning, everyone. It's not often that one gets the chance to work with a consequential and relevant organization like the Bipartisan Policy Center, and with an extraordinary American like Ron Terwilliger on an issue that is immensely important to all of us, and that, of course, is what we've been talking about, housing. So when the opportunity arose to serve as the Terwilliger Center's executive director, I couldn't refuse. The center will build on a strong foundation of housing work here at the BPC. For more than a decade, the BPC has been in the vanguard of forging bipartisan policy solutions to some of our nation's most pressing housing challenges. And as we've heard today, and I completely agree, ensuring that all Americans have access to safe, decent, and affordable home is a vital national interest and is certainly not a partisan issue. So we also hope to bring real urgency to our work, knowing that for too many families, housing is a source of instability rather than security. And as Jason said at the outset, we will be focused on concrete outcomes. I want to thank Secretary Fudge for her remarks today, and let me also express my gratitude to Jason, Pam, Henry, Renee, and of course, Ron. I want to thank you for your generosity and tremendous leadership. We're at work already. This is just beginning. So before I close today's proceedings, let me mention two upcoming events. On September 30th at 9 a.m., the Terwilliger Center will be hosting a webinar with Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota and Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota to discuss the unique housing challenges facing rural Americans. And then on October 18th at 1 p.m., the center will be hosting senior HUD officials and leading experts for discussion on the soon-to-be-released Worst Case Needs Report, which is HUD's biennial assessment of the critical problems facing low-income renter households. So please join us. Check out the Terwilliger Center's page on the BPC website for future developments and activities. And with that, I want to thank everyone listening today in our virtual audience and here at the BPC for helping us launch this center today. Have a good day.